Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and I'm really excited, but also in anticipation, really, for this conversation because I feel that it's such a timely discussion about freedom of the press. So I want to introduce my guest here. Katherine Corcoran is a former Associated Press bureau chief for Mexico and Central America. She has been an Alicia Patterson Fellow, the Hewlett Fellow for Public Policy at the Kellogg Institute at the University of Notre Dame, and a Logan Nonfiction Program Fellow. At the AP, she led an award-winning team that broke major stories about cartel and state violence and abuse of authority in Mexico and Central America. Columns about Mexican politics and press freedom have appeared in the Washington Post, the Houston Chronicle, Time, and Univision Online. She is a former co-director of Cronkite Noticias, the bilingual reporting program at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and of MasterLab, an investigative editor training program in Mexico City. So we're here to talk about Katherine's book, published in 2022, In the Mouth of the Wolf, A Murder, a Cover-Up, and the True Cost of Silencing the Press. And with all of that, welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, Katherine.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm really honored to be here.
So right away, I just have to ask you, even before the investigative case that you cover in The Mouth of the Wolf, what led you to investigative journalism? Where does this career begin for you?
Well, it began when I was in college, and I was a liberal arts major, not sure what I really wanted to do, getting close to graduation and with no prospects. And I decided that I really liked radio and I wanted to be a DJ, which back in the day meant spinning music on a radio station. And those were really hard jobs to get. So I thought, well, if I learn how to do news, radio news, that'll increase my opportunities for like getting on a station. And so I started pretty late in my college career. I went to the college newspaper. I got an assignment. I went out and wrote it. I saw it published the next day with my byline. And I was completely hooked because I was always a writer from the time I was a little kid, and I didn't know that you could write and actually make a living, earn a regular paycheck. And also, I think it was just the storytelling and being around people, just hearing, it was a story, well, I'm going to date myself, but it was during the 1980 election and the rise of Ronald Reagan. And I was in the heartland in Indiana and just went out to hear people's stories about what they were suffering and who they were going to vote for. And it just grabbed me to the point where I've never done anything else since, because I just love real everyday people's stories. I think they're the most interesting stories there are.
Did you think that going into the line of journalism, especially, I'm just curious, like when would you say that you would have categorized yourself as a journalist? Like what year did that happen after you graduated? Was it right away that you then entered the journalism field?
Yes, I had to freelance for a few months before I got a job, but I did get a job at a small newspaper and I worked my way up from there. But you ask about the investigative part. The other thing about the job that is so rewarding is when you write something that causes change and causes positive change. And in my very first job, when I was still a very young journalist, I did a story about some residents who had complained to the city about a intersection that needed a crosswalk because there had been many pedestrian accidents there, car accidents, and they were pretty much ignored by the city council. And so I got the data from the traffic department and I wrote the story and brought attention to the issue. And the next thing you know, they got their stop sign that they've been asking for. And so again, the idea that you can bring certain things to light that will affect change in a positive way, that's what got me also going very early on the idea of not just storytelling, but actual investigating and documenting and telling stories that have impact.
So, calls for freedom of the press as we head into our election year right now. I mean, I just listened to Terry Gross on Fresh Air. She was interviewing Ari Berman. I'm not sure if you know that writer, but he writes for Mother Jones. And I just find that the work that you have done throughout your whole career, this is definitely a layered question, but how do you weigh in right now in terms of what that phrase even means, freedom of the press? Has it drastically changed than when you first entered the profession of journalism?
Absolutely. It's changed a lot. And that became one of the reasons why I wrote the book, not only because of what was happening in Mexico, but what's happening in the United States. When I started my career, freedom of the press was a given. We've never been popular. We've always been the bearer of bad news. We've always been criticized. But, you know, in working, as I mentioned, I love local stories and regular everyday people. And so I worked for newspapers back in the day where when I would show up for a story, people would say, "Oh, we're so glad that you're here." Or they would say, "We like your paper because the other guys never get it right." Or, and there was this feeling of connection with the audience where people, it was obviously pre-internet, and there was this connection where people would take the time to write you letters or call you or come in the front door and say, "I want to talk to a reporter." And so there was a sense that, you know, we were an important pillar of the democracy, which we are. We were created that way. And it was kind of like people knew that. People took that for granted. Now in the information age, with the bombardment of just all the information that people consume in a single day, a lot of it not vetted or verified, there's misinformation, there's manipulation, there's propaganda. I think that sense that connection, number one, has been lost, along with the crash of traditional media in a financial sense, that the financial model for supporting independent media basically fell apart, and we haven't found a good replacement so far. And so there are fewer and fewer newspapers and news outlets, including and especially local news. And so people don't have that connection. They're consuming all kinds of information all day long. And I really feel like the understanding of what the free press is and what the free press does has really gotten lost. And of course, that makes us vulnerable to attack. And you can see that we are being attacked by various politicians. It's a very known strategy, an effective strategy, to say that we're liars, we're corrupt, we write fake news, and people don't really have the sense anymore, like they used to, of what the free press really does.
And I'm assuming when you went into the field of journalism, the idea of being a career journalist, like a celebrity, not a career, but a celebrity journalist, wasn't exactly well known, or where like someone had their own slant as a journalist and they were being an entertainer at the same time. I mean, like, when do you feel that started to happen, the shift where the journalists themselves had to figure out how to profit as their own personality?
Well, I think the entertainment part started with the advent of cable news, 24-hour cable news, which coincidentally started the same year I graduated. CNN was founded the same year I graduated from college. I believe, I would have to fact check that, around the same time. And so there was this urgency to fill airspace 24 hours. And everything, you know, look at that over time, over the last 40 plus years. The criticism now is that everything has to be a big deal, even when it's not, because you've got to hold your viewers. And that is not journalism. A lot of people confuse it with journalism or equate it with journalism, but it's not journalism. And now with the collapse of the financial support of independent media, journalists have to earn their own money and have to create their own sources of income. And that obviously leads to abuse. When I was coming up in the profession, I never wanted to be the center of the story. And the people who did just kind of turned me the wrong way. I mean, like, the story isn't about us. The story is the story. It's not about us. And when it becomes, when the reporter or the journalist makes it about them, that's where I think they cross the line into entertainment and wanting ratings and wanting clicks and wanting all those kinds of things. Whereas, you know, the way I came up, the idea is you do journalism for journalism's sake because the public needs the information, and what the public decides to do with it has nothing to do with you. It's your job to inform the public, period.
So you're saying there's a difference between, like, we should know, an entertainment slash, we could even call them, like, even what I'm doing with my show and being an arts and media company, I'm not a journalist. I'm a critic of sorts. Like, there is a difference. And like, my question to you is, Katherine, how do we, the American people, especially right now, uh, fact check, or even how can we understand the genre of what journalism is and what sources to turn to? Because I think, like you're saying, we're living in an age of oversaturation of news, and everything seems like it's a breaking news story. And it's like we're
Yeah,
like Chicken Little running around. Like, wait, when's the sky falling? It's falling eventually, but it's not happening right now. But they told us it's happening.
exactly. And there's a lot of fatigue now with news feeds because of that. And people just say, I can't look at the news anymore. And that's not a good thing. What I think in this new reality of information bombardment, I think that we journalists need to explain better what we do, how we do our jobs, and how it differs from all the other information that you're consuming. So to understand that we have ethics and standards, that we verify our information, that we have limits to when we think the information is ready to be published. We don't just run out with anything, that we measure when we have a story solidly enough to actually publish it or put it on the air, or whatever the medium is. And that we need to have a two-way conversation with our audience, and we need to hear when we screw up, and we need to respond when we screw up. And we need to differentiate that from what I call the screaming heads on cable. Like, when people always say to me, when they know that I'm a journalist, they say, well, why is the media so biased? And I always use that to start a conversation and say, well, what media are you talking about? And they're inevitably talking about Fox News, MSNBC, and all the people on there yakking away. And what those talk shows are, they're not journalism. They present themselves as journalists. Tucker Carlson says he's a journalist. Tucker Carlson is not a journalist. The commentators from either end of the political spectrum, they're not commentators. They're trying to influence, they're not journalists. They're trying to influence how you think and what you believe. They're trying to sway you. And sometimes it's just outright propaganda. You know, a lot was revealed about Fox News in the voting machine lawsuit, that they actually will ignore the facts to pander to their audience. They need numbers, they need clicks, and that is not journalism.
Yeah. It's almost like a reality TV show of
Exactly,
exciting the
like,
audience, like a soap opera.
exactly. Whereas, you know, I don't know much about reality TV, but they say it's actually quite scripted, and they also provoke the participants to create drama.
Mhm.
And I think in a lot of these talk shows, there's also a lot of provocation. to make you feel angry, or like the country's going down the tubes and we're all divided. And, when you get in those kinds of narratives, and then my issue is that the mainstream media picks them up. And without many times even investigating, are we really that divided? It's a good narrative, it's drama, it's conflict. Storytelling needs conflict. And
Mhm.
so it's good conflict, but is it true? And so to answer your other question, this is what I tell people when they say the media is so biased. I ask them where they get their information, and then they will name various media outlets that they trust. And in one case, a woman was telling me almost apologetically that she likes the BBC because it's not a US based media outlet. And I said, that's fantastic. The BBC is a great source of news. And it also covers the United States as a foreign country. So you get a more critical perspective, I think, from the BBC. And so yes, go to the BBC. I always say, I worked for the Associated Press. I say, go to the Associated Press. I mean, the Associated Press has always been about news and nothing else, straight down the middle. And I worked at many media organizations, and I felt that the AP was the most dedicated to just reporting the news, the least biased. You just went to work every day to report the news. And so, but then I ask people, when they say they get their information from a particular source, I say, well, think about why you trust that source. Like, what are the things that source is doing that makes you trust what they're printing or broadcasting, and support them? Because we are in trouble. Independent journalism is in serious trouble. And so I try to, with these statements like the media is bad, the media is biased, the media is fake, I try to help people sort of break down those concepts and think about, that it's really not a one thing. It's not all eggs in one basket. I mean, you might have a local paper that you love reading every day, and it tells you where the street closures are and where the new restaurants are, and but it's done journalistically. Like, for example, just take an example of like writing about a restaurant. Our ethics say you cannot be paid by the restaurant to write that review. And in many cases, you need to be anonymous so the restaurant doesn't pander to you to get a good review. And so we have these things that we try to provide unbiased information, but it's useful for everyday living. It doesn't have to be a big investigation. There's a lot out there that helps you live your life every day.
And I feel like what you're giving us and providing us is a real blueprint for the power of grassroots, whether it be just living in your community, activism, or like I always say, I find there's more power in my day to day running or walking in my town on Long Island and knowing the business owners than there is on some of these meta high level breaking news stories. Like, you could feel so crushed by the power of the global instead of like realizing the good we're doing on a day-to-day basis as a community. So like, is that something you support? It seems, Katherine, is like finding the power of the local.
Absolutely. And there is a lot of great investigative journalism that goes on every day in the United States of America, and mostly on a local level, that really does make a difference. It has impact. And people know it. People know what it is. People become engaged. I always say that good investigative journalism always rises to the top. It always makes its way through all the noise, because there are certain stories that everybody is talking about, and they're usually or many times they're investigative stories that are revealing something that nobody wanted the public to know.
Well, and that takes me right to your book, In the Mouth of the Wolf, which is, um, I think sometimes even I second guess myself, but your book really opened up and is a true expose in what happens when a government is complicit and even um, behind silencing or even just covering up so much of a story they don't want to get out. So like is it true that there are outlets because of like maybe having corporate money behind them that they won't cover certain stories because that's not beneficial to that corporation that sponsors them?
Well, if it's an independent media organization, that should not happen. Now, of course, we're accused of that all the time. And that's where I was saying earlier that we need to be transparent and we need to meet our critics head on. In the old days, because we were a monopoly, you could get your information from newspapers, television, or radio, period. And we were a monopoly and we were kind of arrogant about what we did and who we were. You know, if people tried to say, well, you can't come in here, it'd be like, well, you know, we're the free press protected by the First Amendment. You can't tell us what to do. And I think that, you know, we need to meet our critics head on. If somebody is saying that we're being biased or we're being controlled by special interests in what we're printing, but that should not happen with an independent news organization.
Yes. So what first, I mean, you have such a personal relationship to your book's um, main figure, to the corrupt cover up that happens. So, just for everyone out there, can you explain, Katherine, like a thesis or just what led you to really looking into this murder and cover up of Regina or Rahina, I think is how you pronounce her name, right? Regina Martinez.
Regina Martinez. Well, I had arrived in Mexico as a journalist, and to make a long story short, Mexico was for many years, a very quiet place for journalists, and you could pretty much go anywhere. And but even before I worked there full time, I went there for a California newspaper just by myself, and I went into the rural areas, and I just would have a taxi driver and a map, and never thought twice about it. So when I arrived to work full time, and all of a sudden there was this explosion in journalist killings, it just, first of all, it was shocking. And second of all, it just didn't make sense. We didn't really understand what was going on, because when you think of journalist assassinations, you think of the Khashoggi case, or the very high profile people, or journalists who've been murdered in Russia, or high profile people that the government wants to silence, and usually an authoritarian government. And so, but in this case, these were very local reporters, and they were not in Mexico City. They were not covering the federal government. They were out in the states in very small markets, earning very small salaries, and they were being assassinated in record numbers. And we were covering these cases, and the government's explanation was, well, they're narco journalists, they're working for the narcos, and they got crossways with their leaders and their bosses, and so they got killed. And that would be end of story. There were no investigations. People would just insist to us, they're not journalists like you're a journalist, an international correspondent for the Associated Press, and so but the numbers were stupefying. I was in an event recently where the moderator used that word, and I'm like, that's exactly the word, stupefying, because they were war zone numbers, and Mexico's a democracy, not a war. And so as time went on, I was attempting to try to explain what was happening. And then I read about the murder of Regina Martínez. And that was really significant. It really stopped me in my tracks because I had tried to hire her to do a story for the Associated Press. I didn't know her personally, but I knew from other colleagues that she was a very good journalist. She'd been vetted by the Associated Press and had worked for us in the past. And so I knew immediately that this was something else. This was something else. And then immediately after the killing, there was a very swift and tight story about what happened from the government, and very heavily insistent that this had nothing to do with her work, when everybody who knew her knew it had to do with her work, because she was a very tenacious, dedicated reporter with standards who wrote many, many critical articles over the years of the government, and actually intentionally did not cover drug cartels, because she knew how dangerous that was. Her interest was marginalized communities and government corruption. And so when she was killed, it was really apparent that something else was going on. And also I had a very brief connection with her. I talked to her on the phone twice. And so I remember feeling like, because before, these journalists were kind of nameless, faceless people, and all of a sudden it hit home. And I thought, this is happening to people who I marginally know.
Yeah. And now she's the cover story of like a government literally trying to craft, like you said, this narrative that you and so many other journalists knew had falsity to it. So how did you decide that you were going to actually go down to Mexico and uncover was behind her murder?
Well, because I had this brief encounter with her on the phone, and because I knew she was a good journalist, the story, I was in Mexico City, working from Mexico City, and she worked in the state of Veracruz, which is on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And there's a giant port there, also named Veracruz, that is the biggest, or was at the time, I haven't checked lately, but it was the biggest import port. So in other words, goods coming into Mexico. So if you think about contraband, drugs, et cetera, that need to be transported up to the United States. And it's a very rich state agriculturally. It's an oil state. There's a lot of money floating around, and a lot to be gained by controlling the state of Veracruz. And it also had a cartel war going on for all those reasons, because it's a very strategic piece of land. And so the story kind of lived in the back of my head, but I was the bureau chief. It was a 24/7 job. I didn't really have time to do any deep dives. And coincidentally, one of her closest friends came to work at the AP, and a friend of mine recommended him again as a good journalist, and he wanted to report on Veracruz, and we needed a freelancer out there. And so he came into the office and did the interview, and I liked him, and I said, yeah, let's give this a try. And then at the end of the interview, I said, do you know anything about this Regina Martínez case? Because it was in the back of my head. And he said, she was one of my closest friends. And so through our working relationship at the AP, we grew to know each other, trust each other as colleagues and journalists. And so when it came time where I had the time to dive into this case, I went to him and I said, I would really like to look into this case. Would you and your friends help me? Because her closest circle of friends had not talked to anyone. They hadn't given any interviews, partly because out of their own safety, and partly because they didn't want to contribute to the frenzy that was going on around her. Like she developed this sort of mythology, and all these people who didn't know her said they knew her and that she was covering the cartels and things like that really weren't. They were sensationalizing the story, and her closest friends didn't want to contribute to that. So they didn't talk to anybody. And so I said, do you think they would talk to me? And he said, well, let me ask. And because he and I had this relationship and we trusted each other, I think that's why her inner circle let me in. And so in a way, it was kind of a stroke of luck. But in journalism, luck plays a big role in getting stories. And we always say luck favors the well-prepared. And so I think because of that coincidence, I was able to get inside the circle and information and write a book that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise, because I had the trust of the people who knew her the best. And as I was diving into this case, it had all the elements that we just talked about, the importance of local news and holding local officials accountable and being an independent journalist and verifying your information and using documents and data. She did all those things at a time when most journalists did not. And that's what made her so unpopular and got her into trouble, is because you couldn't refute what she was reporting.
Yeah. Were you shocked that such a cover-up, or even, her death, could actually happen? Like, did this seem so out of bounds for just the investigative journalism that Regina Martínez stood by on principle?
Well, I think obviously the facts of the case I found outrageous, and the cover-up I found outrageous. But I also found a pattern that this happened with a lot of politically sensitive cases. And as I explained in the book, Mexico was ruled by an authoritarian party for 71 years. It was called the PRI. And the PRI was first voted out of the presidency in the year 2000. And so when she was murdered in 2012, Mexico was and still is very much a fledgling democracy. And so a lot of the traditions under the PRI live on, and especially in Veracruz, because despite the changeover in the federal government, Veracruz continued to be controlled by the PRI. So the PRI actually had a hold on the state longer than it did on the nation. And so under the PRI, everything was controlled and the media was controlled. Reporters wrote the official report, what the government told them to write. And if they didn't do that, the government had many ways to intimidate them short of murder or assassination. They would pull their advertising money and make their finances difficult. They would block their access to newsprint because the government owned all the newsprint. And so there were these carrot stick kind of systems to keep the press in line. And the majority of the press went along, although there were exceptions. And one of the exceptions was the director and founder of the magazine that Regina worked for. It's called Proceso. And it started back in the 1970s being independent and reporting what was really going on. And it too was very unpopular. And so, so she was, in her time when most reporters were controlled, she was not, and she left the office. A lot of reporters would sit in the office and just write whatever came over the transom, or they were literally being paid by politicians to write positive stories about them. And so what she did, that very few people did at the time, is she would leave the office and she would actually go talk to people and ask what was going on. And she would drive to the most rural points of the state to talk about, conflicts where people were being thrown off their land by the government, or people were being denied services by the government, or, there were all kinds of things going on that she wanted to write about because these were vulnerable communities and that's what she cared about. And nobody wrote about them, and nobody took the time to drive 4 hours to some pueblo in the middle of nowhere to find out what was going on. And nobody covered the political opposition, but she did. And that's what made her so effective and made her sources so deep. People really appreciated that she covered voices that never appeared in the media. And so in that way, she really stood out from the time that she started her career in the mid to late 1980s.
Yeah. I mean, it's so her voice, it comes through like in your book, but just the courageous voice she had and how she wanted to literally investigate and not be manipulated in the story that she told. Um, and I think something that you detail so much in your book, which is why everyone needs to get their hands on it, Catherine, is that even though you think the government might be operating, say, in a democracy, it doesn't mean that it doesn't still, like in Mexico, as you so eloquently stated here, that it doesn't still have a vestige of fascist slash authoritarian control. Like there could be multiple elements operating at once.
Exactly. And to answer your question about was I shocked about the cover-up? Under the PRI, the justice system was not to mete out justice. The justice system was to control the message and to protect the people in power. And so under the PRI, there was a lot of manipulation in the justice. The justice system was in the service of the party, not the people. And so if anything politically sensitive or unpopular happened, the government's tactic was to just try to shut it down as quickly as possible. Like find a person, didn't matter if they did it or not, say they did it, many, many times torturing them into confession, throw them in jail so they could say to the public, case closed, time to stop all the noise. And that's exactly what happened in her case. And then I also talk about other cases in the book that have almost the exact same pattern of when something makes political noise, the motivation, even today in Mexico, is not to find out really who did it, but to shut down the noise. And that's why these types of cover-ups happen. And they're almost textbook, like you can recognize in all these cases the same elements, which is let's just shut this down.
Well, and where do you feel freedom of press or freedom of speech, even, which go hand in hand? Where is the Mexican government right now? Are they more on the line of democracy, or do you feel like there still is a silencing and a censorship happening?
Well, even though Mexico's a democracy, the PRI governed the PRI basically governed modern Mexico. And the PRI did a lot of good things for modern Mexico, which authoritarian governments often do. Again, to appease the public, like they built roads and there was a great growth in the economy and the middle class and the education level and all those kinds of things in Mexico under the PRI. And I think that Mexico, they've tried, they're a multi-party system, but the only political model for governing Mexico still is the PRI. And so even though there are open elections, there is now a new party, it's called Morena, that's starting to take over all the branches of the government and all the state governments, just like the PRI did. And the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is an old priesta. People think he's a leftist and he's Hugo Chavez, and it's just not true. He's an old school bureaucrat, priesta, who wants to run everything and wants to control the press. And he's been very critical of the press. Anytime the press criticizes him, in the spirit of democracy, that government needs a watchdog, government needs a counterbalance, he calls them the conservative, and funded by his enemies to take down his administration. He has no value for independent reporting at all. And at one point even said publicly that the role of the press is to support the president. And that was a belief under the press, the editors, the newspaper editors would tell you that back in the 50s and 60s. And so there is this creep now back to the system, even though people are democratically elected in a way that didn't exist under the I would say that in terms of free speech, there's a lot of free speech going on in Mexico. There are demonstrations on the streets all the time. There's a lot of public discourse, very spirited. But for the press, what the press is facing right now is sort of the perfect storm of forces against it. The press, since the advent of democracy, has improved dramatically. And I would say even in the 15 years since I first went there, has become much more professional, much more independent. There's investigative reporting going on at the level of the United States or anywhere in the world. And so the journalism has improved vastly. The independent voices have improved vastly. The problem is they've suffered the same financial collapse of traditional media that we have in the United States and all over the world. So it's difficult to find money to support independent reporting. And then you have the president using his bully pulpit, calling them corrupt, fake news, basically creating a license to attack the media because he's attacking the media. And then you have these local corrupt interests that are not receding, they're actually growing. And those are the people who are actually pulling the trigger. And so so any independent journalist who tries to report on local corruption, particularly if it's the cross between politics and organized crime, are still putting their lives at risk and are still getting assassinated. And so they have physical threats, they have verbal threats, they have financial difficulties that are all working against them at a time when they're doing their watchdog jobs better than ever.
Well, and it seems that, even though this case, your book, your role with the AP was so focused on Mexico, it does seem like you found a way that this is not just in Mexico, but in any type of authoritarian government and society in terms of silencing the press. Like, were there things that surprised you in covering Regina Martinez's case that linked to other countries and what had happened with their press?
Absolutely. In fact, the biggest thing I learned in investigating Regina's case was what was going on in my own country. And it's interesting you say authoritarian governments. Traditionally, those were the governments that tried to control the press. But now it's in democracies. One of the little factoids I found when I started investigating Regina's murder is that the countries that are most dangerous for journalists are democracies. They tend to be emerging democracies, new democracies that are coming out of some type of authoritarian rule. But at the time, the top countries where journalists were being killed were all democracies. And now in my own country, a democracy, there are unprecedented attacks on the press, on the free press and the independent media. And it is a tactic for control because there is this phenomenon now where strong men, strong women, possibly, are using the democratic system to dismantle the democracy. And we've seen it in Venezuela and Hungary and efforts to that effect going on around the world, in the Philippines. And the Philippines, Brazil, Mexico, those are all countries with very high incidents of journalist assassinations. Brazil has gotten better in recent years, but when I started investigating the book, it was at the top of the list. And so you have these efforts around the world to turn back democracy. And guess what? We're seeing it in our country now. And the first line of attack, the first target is the media, the press. Because you don't, if you want to control people and you don't want them reading independent information, you want them to only believe you. And we have politicians now who say that, who say, don't believe them, believe me. Only I can fix it. The authoritarian model has arrived big time in the United States of America. And again, it's textbook. If you want to take on a democracy and create a more authoritarian system, you go down the list. And as I said, the first target is the press. The second target is stacking the courts. The third target is taking away the checks and balances that are written into the system. And we're seeing all of that. We're seeing attempts of all of that in our own country. And that is, well, in the case of Regina, she was living in a system like that already existed. And the government was controlling everything, controlling the propaganda, controlling the press. And that is the goal of these styles of politicians.
Yeah. And since I come from the world of education and higher ed, I feel like anti-intellectualism is at an all-time high right now. And it seems like that goes hand in hand with also the silencing of the press is attacking educators or censoring what topics they can teach. And it like starts with marginalized studies or even what history is being allowed to be taught now, even if it's not factually correct, but it promotes a certain narrative that makes those in power happy or, you know, controlling the literature that exists. Is that something also we have to be aware of?
Yes, it's a very important point because there's also the idea of academic freedom. And if you have press freedom and academic freedom, then people are getting all kinds of information and different points of view. And if you want to control the people, you have to control what they consume. And you see it in history, you see it all over the world. You have the book bannings, you have, attacks on the elite, attacks on the university system. I mean, it's, as I said before, it's textbook because the idea is to create distrust of any official information among the public so that the public goes to the controlling authority for their information, that's the only information that they feel they can trust or that they're told that they can trust. And it's a campaign. It's not by accident. It's a very specific orchestrated campaign. And again, we're seeing it. And you see it at various points in history, even in the United States. So, but this is probably the biggest attack we've ever had in our history. And so, that's what it's about. It's about, and that's why the Regina Martínez story was so important to me, because it illustrates what happens not to the journalist, but to the society when you shut down the free press. Because we're very unpopular, we're bearers of bad news, we're this and we're that, and we're gotcha and all that kind of stuff. But when you don't have independent journalism, as what happened in the state of Veracruz after Regina was murdered, you see that the citizens of that state were victimized by their own government, and there was nothing standing in the way. There were massive disappearances of enemies or perceived enemies. There was massive stealing of public money. There was an atmosphere of intimidation and fear. If people called the police because they had a problem, they received threats for calling the police. The institutions were in full service of the criminal government, not the people who pay for the services and elect the government. And so to me, as I delved into the story, there were just more and more examples and illustrations of the wider issue. And that's why the story is so important and important to the United States, and I think has resonance in the United States, because this is what we're up against if our government succeeds in controlling the information and confusing us about what we can and cannot believe.
And this is why it seems your mission, like you're able to overcome the emotional or even the obstacles that are put in your way of fear or intimidation, of even covering or writing a book about Regina Martínez, is you want to expose the truth and not allow for censorship to happen. Is that correct, Katherine? Like, what keeps you going on this mission?
Well, absolutely. When you see cover up and corruption, you want to root it out.
Mhm.
I, as a journalist, want to root it out. And I knew the whole case against her was a complete sham. And they had intimidated the press in the state into not writing anything about the case. Everybody was too afraid. Anyone who tried to, as you'll see in the book, ends up threatened as well. And so I felt like I had a special position as an outsider and as a foreigner, where I had the ability to go in and if anything didn't seem right or seemed troublesome, I could leave not only the state but the country, and that is not a luxury that these local reporters have. And so I felt like in that sense I had a particular ability to tell the story, and I had the help of her friends, and the cover-up was so outrageous. Of course, I wanted to solve the case. I wanted to show who exactly orchestrated it and why, and expose the lies that were coming from official sources and were coming through a compliant media system that would just print whatever the government told them to print. And so that's why I started on the case. And then as I got into it, I saw this greater meaning and these parallel stories that I think speak to everyone, not just Mexicans.
Well, and I feel like you've also given us, in a time where fear and paranoia are stepping in, your book helps provide, at least it did with me, optimism in what happens when you uncover the truth and you expose corruptness. Like that, we need journalists and we need corruption to be exposed in order to preserve democratic systems. So I want to thank you for the work you're doing, the work you've done, Katherine. Everyone out there, please get your hands on In the Mouth of the Wolf, A Murder, a Cover-Up, and the True Cost of Silencing the Press. I have a link in my show notes for the episode. And Katherine, how can everyone follow you on social media and get in contact with you?
Well, my Instagram is Kathy, Kathy Corcoran, like the author name. Kathy Corcoran author is my Instagram. At Kathy Corcoran is my X account, formerly known as Twitter. And my website is very simply www.katherinecorcoran.com. And so you can find me in any of those places. If you go to my website, there are links to order the book. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, often at your local bookstore. support independent bookstores as well. And yes, any questions you have, any follow-up, I'm happy to respond to.
Well, thank you so much, Katherine. This has been an illuminating conversation. I feel, for my listeners, and I just want to thank you for your time here and the book that you've published.
Well, I want to thank you for your excellent questions and the opportunity to talk about this. So I really appreciate the invitation, and I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you, Katherine. Okay, and bye to everyone listening out there.